Saturn IB, the second of 3 generations of Saturn-class rockets, is being developed for manned space exploration under the direction of NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center. The vehicle consists of 2 stages and an instrument unit. It will have the capability of placing manned spacecraft or large scientific payloads weighing about 40,000 pounds in Earth orbit. The first stage, S-1B, is an uprated, refined, and lighter version of the S-1 stage, the first stage for the completely successful Saturn I vehicle. The Chrysler Corporation is the prime contractor for the Saturn IB first stage. The cluster of 8 engines was increased in power from 1.5 million pounds thrust to 1.6 million. The weight of the booster was reduced by 20,000 pounds, thus giving the Saturn IB a significant increase in performance while retaining the reliability factor which the smaller Saturn has so dramatically shown in actual flight. The second stage of Saturn IB, called S-4B, is a larger, more powerful, and refined version of the Saturn I S-4 stage. S-4B will also be used as the third stage of the Saturn V. The Douglas Aircraft Company is the prime contractor for S-4B. This part alone is as tall as a 5-story building. It will later be used as the third stage of the Saturn V. The instrument unit contains improved versions of the guidance, control, and telemetry subsystems proved in the Saturn I. This same design will be used for Saturn V. IBM is the prime contractor for these instrument units. This first launch vehicle was programmed to perform a suborbital lob shot with the Apollo command and propulsion modules as the payload. They were to be lofted to an altitude of approximately 300 miles by the 2 booster stages. After the first stage burns and drops away, the second stage burns for 7½ minutes. Then its attitude controls tilt the payload to the proper re-entry position. This stage is kicked aside and the command and propulsion modules coast over the apex of the flight path. Small rockets fire to seat the liquid propellants, and the propulsion module engine ignites to increase the re-entry speed. The engine reignites to check the restart capability and further increase the speed. Attitude rockets then turn the command module for re-entry. The propulsion module is kicked aside and the Apollo continues toward the thicker air at a speed of nearly 18,000 miles an hour. This mission was planned to provide a major test of the Apollo heat shield at a high re-entry heating rate and to demonstrate the operation of the propulsion module system and other spacecraft functions, including the recovery system. The cover of the Apollo separates, and the main parachutes open at 2 miles above the water to land the test payload in the ocean without damage. Navy ships stood ready in the recovery area with equipment to raise the capsule aboard ship for the return. Later tests would evaluate the success of the re-entry maneuver. 2 motion picture cameras were prepared for installation on the Saturn first stage to provide a permanent visual record of the separation sequence of the second stage from the first stage in flight. They were also set to show the operation of the liquid hydrogen-fueled engine. The cameras were attached to the first stage and a system was installed to eject them at the appropriate time. Soon after ejection, spring-loaded flaps open to stabilize the cameras and to slow their descent. They re-enter the atmosphere at 7,900 miles an hour. 3 miles above the ocean, a paraballoon fills with gas to expand the balloon. The attached parachute and the balloon produce drag to reduce the capsule impact velocity to prevent capsule damage. The paraballoon also serves as a location aid and floats the camera in the ocean. Upon contact with the water, a fluorescent dye is released to aid recovery. A shark repellent is also released to ward off marine life that could damage the capsule and paraballoon float. A radio beacon attached to the top of the paraballoon transmits a signal to aid recovery planes and ships in the area. The film would be returned to Huntsville, Alabama for study. At the Michoud Assembly Facility at New Orleans, the Chrysler Corporation, under the direction of the Marshall Space Flight Center, started production of the booster stage. Using fabrication and assembly equipment similar to that used for the earlier Saturn, the booster began to take shape. The cluster of tanks first was assembled. The 8 uprated engines added, and the intricate engine controls and the electrical network were installed. With assembly completed, detailed quality checks and tests were conducted on the propulsion, electrical, control, instrumentation, and telemetry systems. A central computer complex supported the operation. The booster was next moved on its transporter to the barge Palaemon to start its long trip up the Mississippi, Ohio, and Tennessee rivers to the ground firing site at Huntsville, Alabama. In March 1965, the stage was in the stand at Huntsville, ready for the static firing. It was fired first for 30 seconds, then 2 weeks later fired for the full flight duration of 2½ minutes. Engine control was tested by gimbaling the engines during firing. All recorded results indicated the stage was ready for its maiden flight. It was then barged to Michoud Assembly Facility for final checks and later to Cape Kennedy, where the NASA Kennedy Space Center team began launch preparations.
The booster stage for the first of these new launch vehicles arrived at the Kennedy Space Center August 14th. Its arrival marked the first time the Port Canaveral lock was used to transfer space cargo from the Atlantic Ocean to the Banana River. Previously, large Saturn barges used a slower route up the Intracoastal Waterway. Upon arrival at the Space Center dock, the first stage was offloaded and taken to Complex 34, where it was erected on the launch stand. Although essentially the same as Saturn I, design improvements reduced the weight of the Saturn IB booster and added 100,000 pounds of thrust.
At the same time the booster was being assembled, the second stage was under fabrication at Huntington Beach, California by the Douglas Aircraft Company under direction of the Marshall Center. This completely new hydrogen-fueled upper stage uses a single 200,000-pound thrust J2 engine. Among the unique features of this stage is the use of a common bulkhead to separate the liquid oxygen from the liquid hydrogen fuel. Special insulation on the bulkhead keeps the liquid oxygen from being frozen by the liquid hydrogen, which has a temperature of 423 degrees below zero. The stage was later moved to the Sacramento Test Center for its pre-flight test firing. A full duration firing of 7½ minutes marked the first time that a fully automatic system had been used to perform a complete checkout, propellant loading, and static firing test on a space vehicle. This engine was also programmed to gimbal in simulation of the guidance commands it would receive in actual flight. After final checkout, the stage was transported by barge from California to the Kennedy Space Center, where flight preparations were underway.
The second stage is also an improved version of its predecessor. This model, burning liquid hydrogen fuel, has one engine, supplying twice the thrust of 6 engines previously used on the Saturn I second stage.
Meanwhile, the instrument unit, the brain or nerve center of the Saturn vehicle, was under joint development by the International Business Machine Corporation and the Marshall Center at Huntsville, Alabama. This unit provides the commands for engine gimbaling, in-flight sequencing of the engine propulsion system, staging operations, telemetry, and all primary timing signals. The Saturn IB instrument unit is essentially the same instrument section which will be used on later Saturn V launch vehicles. The complete payload for the Saturn IB space vehicle was developed by North American Aviation under the direction of NASA's Manned Spacecraft Center, Houston, Texas. For the first Apollo Saturn IB flight, this consisted of the command module, the propulsion module, a weight simulating the lunar module, and the launch escape system. Upon completion of the first flight payload, the sections were transported to the launch center for addition to the booster.
By the fall of 1965, the first Block 1 flight article, spacecraft 009, had completed subsystems installation and was fitted with its aft heat shield. The spacecraft's modules and launch escape subsystem were then moved to the final checkout area and mated in preparation for acceptance testing and buy-off.
Complex 34 was modified to accommodate Saturn IB. Work platforms were constructed which completely enclosed the rocket during pre-flight checkout. An ingress-egress elevator was added. An automatic checkout center was built under the pad. And new equipment was installed in the Launch Control Center. Since Saturn IB will also be launched from Complex 37, modifications there are already underway. Saturn IB will give the United States the capability for 3 manned space flights in Earth-orbiting missions of the Apollo spacecraft.
At Cape Kennedy, pre-flight checks of S-1B-1s continued through this period. S-4B was stacked atop the first stage October 1st, following pre-erection checks. SIU-201 arrived at the Cape aboard the Palaemon. Following pre-erection checks, the instrument unit was stacked atop the second stage October 25th. Vehicle pre-flight checkout began immediately and continued throughout the quarter.
The first Apollo spacecraft arrived October 25th, and a variety of tests were begun in preparation for an early 1966 flight. The engine section of the Apollo, or service module, underwent static test firings to verify the propulsion system. The command module, or crew compartment, underwent inspection and checkout at the Manned Spacecraft Operations Building. During these tests, the spacecraft will be placed inside an altitude chamber, where it is subjected to simulated altitudes up to 250,000 feet. These 200-ton stainless steel structures are the largest man-rated chambers in the world.
The Apollo command module arrived at the Cape October 25th. 2 days later, the service module was delivered. Following extensive testing, including static firing of the service module, both units were erected December 26th.
The mated command and service modules provided the first view of flight-configured Apollo spacecraft modules. On December 26th, the command and service modules and the attached adapter section were mated to the Saturn IB launch vehicle 201 at Launch Complex 34.
To test the complicated systems of the Apollo spacecraft, a high-speed computer system was installed in the same building. The facility is called an ACE station, meaning acceptance checkout equipment for Apollo spacecraft. Signals are sent from the test area or launch pad to one of 5 such ACE stations, where the information is processed for immediate evaluation. By year's end, the Saturn IB and Apollo spacecraft entered the final phases of checkout in preparation for its maiden flight in 1966.
Early January, the launch escape system for AS-201 was erected atop the Apollo spacecraft, completing erection of the space vehicle on Launch Complex 34, Cape Kennedy.
Throughout January and February of 1966, pre-flight tests were conducted to ensure every possibility of mission success. the unmanned spacecraft was scheduled to be launched on a 5,000-mile ballistic trajectory down the Atlantic test range. The mission would also help confirm the all-up concept of flight testing, in which all launch vehicle and spacecraft components will be flown together live for the first time.
During early February, several technical meetings were held to evaluate the data from the various pre-launch tests, including the Space Vehicle Countdown Demonstration Test and the Flight Readiness Test. Following two postponements caused by unfavorable weather, final launch preparations were begun. This final countdown was interrupted by two launch vehicle holds, both because of low pressure in the gaseous nitrogen control pressure sphere.
Launch morning, February 26th, low gaseous control pressures in the launch vehicle forced several recyclings of the countdown and an eventual scrub. However, 10 minutes later, the problem was corrected and the scrub decision was reversed.
The countdown proceeded toward the moment of ignition. The firing team made final checks and evaluations. A successful firing would mean that the United States Apollo Saturn program for the conquest of the moon and beyond was proceeding as planned.
At 11:12 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, February 26th, unmanned Apollo spacecraft 009 was launched on a 5,000-mile ballistic trajectory down the Atlantic test range.
This liftoff marked the first use of a new flight testing procedure for the Saturn program, the all-up concept, where all stages and modules of the first flight vehicle are live or functioning units. The Chrysler-built first stage and the 8 Rocketdyne H-1 engines performed well within tolerances. The pressure of the gaseous nitrogen control pressure sphere was as planned during flight. At T plus 141 seconds, the 4 inboard engines cut off, followed 6 seconds later by the outboard engines. Within a few seconds, successful stage separation had been achieved, and the second stage engine ignited. As shown by a camera mounted in the first stage, separation disturbances were quite small, with the first stage being very stable.
Staging occurred approximately 2.5 minutes after launch. The 200,000-pound thrust second stage engine ignited and propelled the spacecraft to a 310-mile altitude.
The Douglas-built second stage's overall performance was excellent. This was the first flight test of the stage and its J-2 engine. The engine, built by Rocketdyne, is the most powerful liquid hydrogen engine being manufactured. After about 20 seconds of second stage burning, the launch escape tower of the 46,000-pound Apollo spacecraft was jettisoned. The instrument unit, built by IBM, performed precisely as designed, commanding the flight of the vehicle through payload separation. This was also the first flight test of the instrument unit, which, like the second stage, will be used with the Saturn V launch vehicle. 10 minutes after liftoff, the second stage engine had completed its job and shut down. At this point, the Apollo spacecraft was 160 miles high, traveling over 15,000 miles per hour. After reaching an apogee of about 300 miles, the spacecraft was propelled back into the Earth's atmosphere by its service module engine to provide an extreme test for the command module's heat shield.
Mission objectives included subjecting the command module's heat shield to a fast re-entry heat buildup. 2 burns of the service propulsion subsystem accelerated the re-entry speed of the spacecraft so that heat rate buildup approached the values that will be encountered during lunar mission re-entries. Fluctuations in SPS engine firing chamber pressures degraded the entry velocity, resulting in lower surface temperatures than planned. However, data protractions verified that the current heat shield design is able to withstand an atmospheric entry from a lunar mission. 40 minutes later, the command module landed approximately 43 nautical miles short of its predicted impact point. Recovery was performed by crews aboard the carrier Boxer.
The command module was recovered in the South Atlantic by Department of Defense Recovery Forces and returned for detailed study. The complete success of AS-201 in performing its prime missions, which included verifying spacecraft and launch vehicle compatibility and launch vehicle structural integrity, provided NASA with increased confidence in meeting its manned space exploration goals as planned.